Chapter 25. The windswept chill of the winter morning urged the office supplies delivery man on to greater speed as he pushed his cart towards the front door of a large office building near Columbus Circle. "The freight elevator, you," the building porter reminded him, pointing with a fat thumb. The delivery man pushed his cart around the corner, went inside, and pushed the button to call the freight elevator. Then he got himself and his cart into the elevator and pressed the button for the 8th floor, where the headquarters of the Carlisle Addressing Machine Company were located. This delivery was one of the highlights of his delivery route because Mr. Carlisle, company president, had a particularly lovely young secretary who sat just outside of the president's office door. This girl was one of the scenic glories of New York, thought the delivery man. He came out on the 8th floor, knocked where Carlisle Addressing Machine Company was painted in bold letters across the double-wide glass doors, and the receptionist came out to see him. Mr. Carlisle's private secretary had been a receptionist at the beginning, but it was obvious to see that a girl of that caliber would not be left to guard a mostly empty office lobby for long, and Mr. Carlisle would have been a fool not to want her closer. She lasted as receptionist for under half a year before Mr. Carlisle proved he was no fool and placed her right in front of his imposing wooden office door. This new receptionist looked sleepy and possibly hungover, with her hair a strange color that looked like it must have come from a cheap bottle. There had been a few receptionists in rapid succession here, and none of them had been given the supplies closet key, so the glory of New York always had to be called for him when he arrived. Ah, how fortunate. The latest receptionist pointed listlessly in the direction of the lobby sofa, and he sat down next to his cart to wait. The reception area had no windows, which made waiting there quite dull, but a few more minutes and, there she was. Today she was radiant, her hair pulled gracefully back on her head in an all-business chignon, in the long pencil skirt that she almost always wore, this time with a warm-looking scarf tucked around her neck beneath her lady's suit jacket, which was decorated with a brooch that she always wore. He knew every detail of her look. He also knew, from when he watched her hands as she took his clipboard to sign his order delivery form, that she wore no wedding band. Now, her dark high heels beat out a light, smooth beat across the floor as she came closer. "Good morning, Mr. Neville," said Mr. Carlisle's private secretary. Mr. Neville smiled. "Good morning, ma'am. I have your supplies right here. If you can please just sign on the line as usual." "With pleasure, Mr. Neville," she said, signing. "Follow me." She handed him back his clipboard and pushed open the door at the end of the reception lobby, and held it for him while he got his supplies cart through it, and then they walked through the main floor office area between the desks to her dark wooden desk with her nameplate on it, with the window overlooking Manhattan just behind it, and where the paperwork stood in perfectly straight, neat piles. "I've picked up the wrong key," she said by way of explanation, and then she sat down behind her desk, unlocked the drawers, and pulled out another keyring. "It is this one." They walked past Mr. Carlisle's office door to the supplies closet. She always held the door open while he unloaded the supplies and placed them on the shelves. At first, she had had to indicate to him where she wanted everything to go, but now it had become routine. He busied himself with putting everything in perfect order, hoping to please her, but all she ever said was a plain, "Thank you." This she said to him now, and then she accompanied him back to the receptionist's desk. He thanked the beautiful secretary, smiled hopefully, and then watched her as she walked back onto the main office floor. It was always over so quickly. He sighed. Then he turned his head and looked at the latest receptionist, who was busying herself with peeling flaking polish off of her nails with her pen cap. No, she would never become a president's private secretary. The odds were low that she'd even be at this desk again when he returned in 2 weeks' time. Some girls just had it, and others did not. He sometimes thought about marrying and settling down. But what if he ended up with someone like this creature? He shuddered, managed a weak goodbye, and pushed his now much emptied cart back out toward the service elevator. Back inside the Carlisle Dressing Machine Company, the workers on the main office floor quietly resumed their standard, uneventful workday morning. Mr. Carlisle's secretary returned to her desk, allowed herself a moment to gaze out of the window onto the cold gray winter day, and then she took up a packet of correspondence work, fed a sheet of office paper into her typewriter, correctly aligned the margin for her first line, and began to type. Within a few minutes, the buzzer on her talkaphone intercom on her desk went off. "Yes, Mr. Carlisle?" she asked politely. "Please come into my office. 2 black coffees, please. Mr. Ward is here, and come prepared to take dictation," said Mr. Carlisle's voice, coming slightly distortedly out of the small black machine. "Yes, sir. It will only be a moment," replied the girl. She got up, went to the small office kitchen, pulled the small silver tray out of the locked cabinet, to which only she had the key, and told the 2 colleagues standing by the coffee machine to please excuse her, but Mr. Carlisle had requested 2 coffees, and of course everyone knew that Mr. Carlisle's order came first. The girl did not add that Mr. Ward was visiting, because that would have been indiscreet, and also because it was a worrisome sign. Mr. Ward was the primary legal counsel for the Carlisle Dressing Machine Company, and there had been an ongoing legal tussle with a competitor company recently over a patent. Should the court rule in favor of the competition, the company's future looked bleak. The girl returned to her desk with the tray and 2 black coffees, where she grabbed her dictation notebook and pencil, tucked her dictation notebook and her to-do items notebook under her arm, got the tray with the coffees, and then smoothly opened the door to Mr. Carlisle's office with all of her items on her person and ready to go. The 2 older gentlemen looked up and smiled appreciatively as she walked in and set the silver coffee tray down on the small conference table by the window. "Ah, Miss Westcott, prompt as ever," said Mr. Carlisle with a smile. "How do you do, Miss Westcott? It is good to see you again," said Mr. Ward, rising politely before reseating himself. "How do you do?" murmured the girl politely. Once she had not known the proper response to this greeting. She had also not known whether it should perhaps be accompanied by a small curtsy or some such thing, but now she knew exactly what to do. She sat down, professional and straight-spined, in the smaller chair that was reserved for her use and placed at the side of Mr. Carlisle's desk. She opened the larger of her 2 notebooks and prepared herself with her pencil to take dictation. The gentlemen helped themselves to their coffees, and Mr. Carlisle waved his cup and saucer toward the window. "This weather is abysmal, and I'm heartily sick of it." "Smoke?" he asked. Mr. Ward shook his head. "Mrs. Ward and my doctor have joined forces, and they keep telling me how it wreaks havoc with my blood pressure." "Which wreaks havoc with my blood pressure?" Mr. Carlisle smiled pleasantly. One likes to see such practical sense and self-control in one's chief attorney. I, however, will have a smoke. He set his coffee down, took a cigarette from the box, and lit it. As the legal uncertainties continued, Mr. Carlyle sent his private secretary out for cigarettes with increasing frequency. The smoke from the cigarette's burning end wafted aesthetically, if malodorously, through the closed room of the office. The girl had long ago trained herself to suppress the urge to rub at her nose or to sneeze. "So, Miss Westcott, here's what we need from you today. A letter must go out to the board of directors with the invitation to the next board meeting for next month, together with a summary of the points that Mr. Ward will now list. Mr. Ward, my secretary is ready. Please proceed." Mr. Ward's style, the girl already knew, was to speak at length, to break off from key points with irrelevant side remarks about Mrs. Ward or politics or traffic congestion, to return from these distractions without remembering exactly where he left off, and then to speak quickly to make up for lost time, and finally need to be reminded of which points he already made so he could reorganize and rally his thoughts for one final, concluding onslaught. If a secretary could take dictation from Mr. Ward, she could take dictation from anyone. The girl was able to do it without blinking. "Wait just a moment. Did I already mention Section 6 of the Elliott Court materials?" asked Mr. Ward, when he at last reached the confused point that he always reached after a few minutes of speaking. "Yes, sir," said the girl. "We have covered Sections 4, 5, and 6. Will there need be mention of any other sections?" "Oh, dear," said Mr. Ward. "Now I am not certain. Could I trouble you to please read back what we have so far?" "It is no trouble," said the girl primly. She read back what she had taken down, and both men nodded. It took another few minutes, but Mr. Ward finally got all of his information across, adding that she needed to put "confidential" on top of all the pages. Then Mr. Carlyle gave her a list of follow-up items to take care of in regards to the board of directors meeting. The girl switched notebooks, opened her slightly smaller notebook where she usually listed out her to-dos, folded the next sheet in it lengthwise so that the crease down the center separated it into two neat halves, and she began to take down the items. Board of directors meetings took from afternoon into the evening, so those were always days that she disliked. But as the girl always kept her face completely blank, no one knew what her likes or dislikes were. In fact, no one knew anything, and that is the way that she wanted to keep it. She took her leave of the gentleman, returned to her desk with her notebooks, looked at the clock, and saw that it was practically lunchtime. Since becoming Mr. Carlyle's private secretary, once a week she splurged and treated herself to lunch at the nearby automat on Broadway, and this was that day. "Lois, please cover for me," she said to the woman whose desk was nearest to hers. "I'm going out for my lunch break." "Certainly, Vivian. My pleasure," said Lois. They had become close colleagues over the past year, and they alone called each other by their first names. The girl went to the coat closet to pick up her coat and hat. On the ride down in the elevator, she checked the time on the elevator clock. Mr. Carlyle prized promptness above many other virtues, and she had a reputation to maintain with him. The elevator doors opened out onto the lobby, and she stepped out, becoming one young woman among many people, milling through the lobby of the large office building. There was the interior doorway to the Carlyle Addressing Machine Company showroom, whose main door faced out directly onto the street, and inside were the sales clerks who were busy at work, providing a continued livelihood for everyone up on the 8th floor. The girl adjusted her hat, pulled her scarf and coat closer, made sure her gloves were on tight, took a deep breath, and passed through the revolving doors and out into the bitter cold. Although she had lived in New York for many years now, and at this rate it would soon be 9 years, she reflected, if there was one thing about life in New York that she would probably never get used to, it was the cold. Vivian, the girl, had grown up in a warm and tropically humid place. Miss Westcott, the professional young secretary that the girl had become, was forced to live in a place that was tropically humid for a few weeks out of the year, but that was near Arctic for many, many weeks out of the year. She had never owned a heavy winter coat before she came to live up north. There was no need for such a garment back where she had come from. Cold weather had not been the only thing that she had had to get accustomed to, of course. It was like moving to another country. The English that people spoke was different, sounded different, and used different words. They also spoke it at a speed about 7 times faster than the speed that anyone spoke back home. For the first 3 years, whenever she had opened her mouth to utter a single sentence, New Yorkers had laughed. She started working on that problem even before she started stenography and typing night classes. She might have been laughed right out of the job interview for the position of a telephone switchboard operator in her early days, but that had just put her on another path that was ultimately a far better paid one. Her accent would never entirely disappear, but now at least she could compensate for it by moving through the office like a secretary in a Hollywood film, spine ever straight, and her suit jacket tapered attractively near her always slender waist. Her work was likewise diligent and of the highest quality. The truth was, she could not bear not to fit in. She could not bear to be ridiculed, and she did not want to be caught by anyone in a moment of uncertainty or lack of poise. The other girls in offices were often mean, and once you got on their bad side, they might gossip about you, and your good reputation might be impossible to get back. Clothing and hairstyle were important elements as well. Office girls wore close-fitting, dark-colored suits, and although it might take several miles to walk all over town each day, stylish heels were simply mandatory, even if the snow piled about in 3-foot-high drifts. If a young office girl fell into a snowdrift, it might even end up working in her favor if she could convince a passing unmarried executive to lend her a hand and help her back up. But no office girl would be caught dead in comfortable shoes. Before she had turned herself into one of them, Vivian the girl had spent a lot of time making sandwiches at a lunch counter in another office building, all the while observing the way that office girls dressed and comported themselves. It was not important to have many clothes, but the ones that one did have had to be of a quality cut and of the right material, or else it would be impossible to fit in. And fitting in was what it was all about. Everything that Vivian had learned about the life of an office girl in New York had been self-taught, closely observed, and practiced in night school and in a string of temporary jobs until she had turned herself into what she was now. She looked younger than she was, she knew, and she used this to her benefit. It had landed her the position in Mr. Carlyle's office, and occasionally at lunch it landed her a free half sandwich from a passing young man. Lift operators were extra polite to her, and she took care to smile back in case she ever needed a favor later, such as learning which companies in that building might be hiring secretarial help. She encouraged in others the view that she was only recently come to the city and was beginning her upward career path, whereas, in fact, there had been a hard half-decade that she did not want anyone to know about, a time of clawing her way toward even the lowest rung of the New York office world. She sat down in the automat on this particular day at a small table by the window, and she looked out into the street. The people walking on the opposite side of Broadway looked a bit out of focus, and Vivian wondered vaguely whether she should begin wearing the glasses that the optometrist had prescribed for her a few months ago, when her office building had had a free optometrist checkup day in the building lobby. All that typing was probably making her vision weaken, but she had worked too hard to look this good to now ruin it by wearing unattractive eyewear. The glasses remained stubbornly in a drawer at home. Lunch was a quick and small affair. A slice of apple pie was something she rarely allowed herself because of the expense of it, if for no other reason. Coffee she would have back in the office. A small cup of soup helped to get the half sandwich down. Her to-do list from Mr. Carlyle involved making travel plans for the 2 out-of-town board members, arranging for catered food to be brought in for the meeting, restocking the office bar cart that Mr. Carlyle kept behind his desk, and preparing documents in multiple copies for the meeting attendees. She would have to work with Lois on that. Everything had to be done perfectly, because that was the standard that Vivian set for herself in her professional work, but also, at least in part, because she wanted Mr. Carlyle to be satisfied with everything. He was a good man, and he had given her a wonderful chance when he had promoted her to his private secretary, a fact for which Vivian was very grateful. She did not want to let him down. He had taken a risk with her, and she wanted to ensure that it would pay off for him. On the one hand, her work was in a comfortable, heated office, but on the other hand, the days could be grueling, especially once the commute was tacked on, and in late winter it was invariably dark before she returned home. By the time she climbed out of the train in Queens and dragged herself toward her apartment building, she was more than ready to throw her heels across the room and soak her aching feet in Epsom salt. Today was no exception. She turned the key in the lock as quietly as she could, hoping as always to get a few moments of respite first on the sofa. But the door was not even open yet when the small and excited footsteps started running full speed towards her. "Mama, Mama!" cried the small girl. "Oh, Sophie, at least give me a chance to come inside," said Vivian, entering the apartment and closing the door behind her. She set her hat, gloves, and pocketbook down on the small table and picked Sophie up. "What is Grandmama feeding you? You're getting to be so heavy," she said. Sophie laughed happily. Vivian's mother came out of the small kitchen. "She is just like you were, Vivian, and refuses to eat much at all. I'm sure I've no idea where she gets the energy from to grow like this." Vivian carried Sophie over on her hip and gave her own mother a kiss on the cheek. "Thank you for trying to feed her, at least. It certainly doesn't feel like she's wasting away. How did the dress fitting today go?" They all went back into the tiny kitchen, where Sophie's largely untouched dinner sat on the table. Vivian sat Sophie back down in front of it, on top of a pile of cushions, so that Sophie could sit up comfortably high enough at the table. "Well, I left Sophie at Edith's again, and then I left for the fitting. That was probably at 10 this morning. The fitting went well, I dare say. I hope this will turn into some additional recommendations among Mrs. Baker's friends, because Mr. Baker keeps his wife on a very stingy budget, on which many new dresses cannot be afforded. I came back to get Sophie by around noon, and her and little Robert were already at each other's throats." Vivian looked at Sophie. "Why are you such a tyrant to that little boy? Miss Edith will not let you come and stay if you are so mean to Robert. Do you not like Robert?" Sophie smiled happily. "I like Robert," she said in her child's voice. Apparently, pounding the stuffing out of him on a regular basis did not equate in her little mind to not liking him. "Well, he will not long like you if you are so unkind to him," said Vivian. And then she sighed. "Things look uncertain at the office, Mother. You know we are being sued by a much larger competitor, Ellison a dressing machine, over a patent. It does not look good." "What will you do?" asked her mother. "I will wait until next month's board meeting, and then hear what the news is. If it looks uncertain, I will stop by the stenography school and leave my name as available for new job opportunities," said Vivian. "It seems disloyal somehow, after everything that Mr. Carlyle has done for you, though. Do you not think so, Vivian?" asked her mother. "Perhaps," replied Vivian, putting out plates for her and her mother to join Sophie for dinner. Vivian did hope that Mr. Carlyle's fortunes would improve, but at the next board meeting, the news was anything but good. She sat in her small chair, now brought over into the boardroom, and was taking down the meeting minutes. Mr. Ward was explaining to the board members how the paper feeding mechanism that the latest Carlyle addressing machine models featured would very likely be ruled a violation of a patent held by Harmon P. Elliott. Elliott addressing machines already held a significant market share, whereas Carlyle machines had never managed to gain much above a 10% market share. The board meeting then proceeded to a lengthy review of the financial statements of the company, and everyone was on edge. Vivian stopped by the stenography school the very next day and left her name. If there was such a thing as loyalty that could be expected in this business, then it was not a luxury that she could afford. With a small child to raise and a mother to help support, and a husband nary in sight, there was only one key criterion for her next job, and that was that it would pay better than her current position. She had passed in and out of enough office doors by now to feel confident that she was up to the task, wherever the next job took her. Her life since leaving New Orleans had hardened her, and had further validated her already practical life outlook. Vivian had never been a girl to believe in fairy tales, and the way her life had turned out had proven her right. She never once imagined that her mindset had helped to create its own validation. Life was just this way. The key was to never look back, and to never let the anguish inside come out. In the beginning, she had wanted to run away and to take the next train back south, but she had always been too stubborn to admit failure. Then it looked like there might be a child, but it turned out not to be. It was a nightmare to lose a baby in the early months of her first pregnancy, and her mother was so far away. Vivian had thought she would not live through the grief of it. Afterward, it took her months to mourn. She would sit alone, curled up in the old armchair that she had dragged up north with her after her wedding, and she would throw a blanket over herself and just cry and cry. But life cannot break you in the same way twice, once a wound partly heals, and the loss of her second child, an unborn son, was far less devastating, although physically it took a lot more out of her, since it happened further along in her pregnancy. She began to wonder if she would ever have a child, and she tried not to think about the line that life was drawing for her between physical passion and death. What good did it do to dwell on these things, after all? Her diet was poor. Her health was fragile. She was eroding her body in the constant effort to bear a child, as well as in the hard work of multiple odd jobs, from cleaning toilets in a hotel, to standing all day behind a sandwich counter, to eventually working as a waitress in several small restaurants. She never left a job. She merely added another one to it. The cost of living near New York was exorbitantly high. A family of 6 could feast for dinner back in New Orleans on the cost of what one reasonable dinner for 2 could cost in New York. The war created opportunities that would never otherwise have come about, and in Vivian's case it gave her her first big chance, making good use of her seamstressing skills by working in the textile industry in a company that made the more rigid backing used for the collars of military uniforms. From there, she took up light clerical work in addition to her work on the sewing floor, and eventually she was able to attend stenography and typing classes at night on a special wartime stipend. From there, she had the skill set to apply for other office work, and she had not lacked for a job since then. Sophie's birth came at an interesting time, in the midst of the war. Vivian's marriage had been on the rocks for a couple of years, and in hindsight it amazed her that Chip had even hung around long enough to father Sophie. How had they ever made it through 6 whole years together? It must have been because time flew, as Vivian spent her days alone and working her fingers to the bone while Chip was away. By the end, Vivian found that she could suddenly face the end of her marriage with dry eyes and an entirely cool mind. It was clear that they were never going to work as a couple, and it was purely out of apathy and almost oversight that Sophie had been conceived. Once she had Sophie, Vivian really had no further need for Chip, and a fortuitous gust of the winds of fate blew him out of her life at just that moment. Vivian wrote to her mother, asked if she would come up to New York, or if Vivian should move back home, and her mother came up north. Everyone knew that there were far more war-related new jobs springing up in New York than in New Orleans. Vivian knew she would never have made it through Sophie's baby years without her mother's help, and she was deeply grateful. Having made friends with Edith, a woman married to a traveling salesman who lived down the hall from them and who had a small son, made things complete. Edith watched Sophie during the times that Vivian's mother went about her seamstressing work, and Vivian paid a small monthly amount to Edith for her help. As long as Vivian had a job, their world could continue to go round, and Sophie always came first, above everything, above Mr. Carlyle and everyone at the office, above even what Vivian might have ever wanted for herself. Every slice of pie that Vivian did not buy at the automat could turn into a small treat for Sophie on a Sunday. The math was very simple. Even her odd jobs had not entirely ended. Up until her most recent promotion to the role of Mr. Carlyle's private secretary, she had continued to help out at one restaurant, and although it was in Queens and her office positions were in Manhattan, she still dreaded that someone she knew from her professional life in the city might ever show up there and see her waiting tables. Now, there were nights when she would help her mother with her sewing, just as they had done back in New Orleans, as if nothing had ever changed except the walls of the apartment around them. When her mother could finish a blouse or a tablecloth or a set of curtains quicker, that meant that her mother could take up new jobs more quickly, and that also meant more money and more clothing and food for Sophie. A few weeks later, with Sophie's well-being foremost in her mind, Vivian asked Mr. Carlyle for a private word, and she gave him her 2 weeks' notice. Mr. Carlyle was stunned. Would she reconsider? He would put in a small raise for her if only she would agree to stay. She was doing such wonderful work. But Vivian shook her head. As Mr. Carlyle's disappointment began to get the better of him, he began to make the argument to Vivian that she owed him some loyalty after the way that he had elevated her so quickly to the post of his private secretary. Vivian stood up, repeated her thanks for the job, but reaffirmed that she had already accepted another position, and that was the end of it. Back at her desk, she called Lois over to set up time for them to transition the keys and all of the notes. Lois was incredibly surprised as Vivian handed over the notebook that she used for dictation. The smaller, private notebook for her to-do items Vivian kept with her. The days flew quickly by, and then 2 weeks later, Vivian was walking through the rotating glass door of another large office building, just down the street from Columbus Circle as it happened, and she found herself riding the elevator up to the 10th floor, to the insurance records department of the Manhattan National Life Insurance Company, where she folded in half the next sheet in her small notebook and prepared to take down the new work asked of her. What did it matter where her exact place of employment was? Hold your head high, keep your spine straight, never look back, and never, ever cry. Mr. Neville office supply delivery man to the Carlisle Addressing Machine Company, was disappointed to learn that the glory of New York had left her job as Mr. Carlisle's private secretary. But he was not entirely surprised when the company went bankrupt a mere 8 months later. Supplies orders had been getting smaller and smaller for a number of months. Her going must have taken the lifeblood out of the place. Vivian's change of employer hardly fazed her. When she worked somewhere, nobody ever really got to know anything about her. No one ever knew that she had a daughter. No one knew how old she really was, or where she lived, or what her life was like. The job was a kind of theater where she became, for the duration of the workday at least, someone without any past, without any personality almost. Someone who was a universally interchangeable cog in a faceless system. Her career outlook continued favorably at the Manhattan National Life Insurance Company, and quite soon she went from purely clerical tasks in the records library to working directly with in-process claims records. When she sat at her desk, and her work almost literally flew off of it, it was easy to block out the fact that the rest of her life could be described as a failure. She was well aware of the stigma of raising a child without a husband in the picture, but fortunately it was a stigma that the ending of the war had made less burdensome because there were so many war widows about, especially in a large city like New York, with its hope of employment opportunities for these women. Vivian told people who had to be told something, people like Edith, whose own husband was a traveling salesman and who was therefore hardly ever home, that her husband had died in the war. With Edith, this turned out to be an unfortunate choice of lie, because Edith put Vivian in touch with another woman in their apartment building named Angela, who had, in fact, really lost her husband in the war. Angela had no children. She had joined a number of other war widows in the city who had as their primary club goal the organizing of social mixers and dances with former servicemen at VFW halls and similar other venues. Vivian had absolutely no desire to go to afternoon tea dances and have former servicemen lay their hands on her, and she even briefly considered admitting to Angela that she was not really a war widow, but then the discomfort of confessing to such a vile lie to a woman who had in fact lost a much-loved husband in the war was just too great, and so Vivian said nothing. After a few more invitations, Vivian explained that she was very busy raising Sophie and that she was just not ready to meet a new man. "Ah, I understand. The grief is still too raw," Angela said, nodding. "I will be sick," thought Vivian. "This is the price for my lying." She lowered her head and made a small, strangled sound. The only risk of physical harm that Chip had ever faced was the risk that Vivian would poison him in a fit of rage. Their last years together had been tempestuous. "In that case, you might want to come with me to a widows-only discussion group that meets once a month, where we sit in a circle and remember what we most loved about our husbands," suggested Angela hopefully. "It is very comforting to be able to discuss these things with other widows." I think I'm just not ready for that either," Vivian finally managed to say, her face burning with shame. Angela placed a consoling hand on Vivian's shoulder. "Take your time. You will heal. You will find someone new, and you will love again." Late that night, Vivian lay in the darkness listening to Sophie breathing in her sleep beside her, and Angela's words came back to her. the War Widows Club and its events notwithstanding, did Vivian want to find someone new to love, and to have someone to love her? It had taken a while to clean up the mess that Chip had left her in, but now she was free to remarry if she wanted to. Did she want to? If a man like Mr. Carlyle, who had been married but who had clearly looked at Vivian and liked what he saw, if a man like that were to be single and were to ask her to be his wife, would she agree for Sophie's sake? If there were no Sophie, would Vivian do it for her own sake? She had already married once for the wrong reasons. No, I'm not going to take a nibble from that poisonous mushroom again, she thought. She would rather spend the rest of her days alone. But there was Sophie to consider. Well, all of these thoughts were entirely theoretical, since Vivian met no men, and gave a swift brush-off to any who dared to approach her. Her new job put her in the middle of a very large company, sprawled across several floors of a huge building, and in her first months, Vivian had had a lot of brushing off to do, to indicate that she was not interested, but at last the word seemed to have gotten around. The challenge was that, in addition to the headquarters men, there were many young insurance salesmen coming and going for trainings or for other meetings, and they required constant, ongoing brushing off. "So, is there a Mr. Westcott?" the ones who thought themselves particularly clever would ask her. There is somewhere, thought Vivian bitterly. It did not matter to her what these men looked like. The unhandsome ones she glared down, and the handsome ones she fled and evaded, so that they would not fluster her. With the frothy days of adolescence behind her, she reverted back to her original mindset from before she had married Chip, where she did not want to be touched by anyone, although, unlike then, now she really was starved for adult affection. In truth, she had no understanding of the extent of damage that had happened to her heart in her unfortunate marriage. She only knew that it hurt to contemplate digging for hope within herself to try such an experiment over again. Self-pity was not one of her failings, and she never thought that she was being asked to face something unreasonable in her life, whether it was being little better than a child bride when she was torn away from family and home, to losing one pregnancy after another, to struggling for money, or to finally living a life nearly all alone and trying to raise a small child. It was just the way that things had turned out, that was all. Since those first lonely and overwhelming years up north, she did not think of Gregory often, and she told herself that she was too practical for pointless pining. Occasionally, she remembered him with bitterness, wondering if this entire path that her life had taken was the outcome of having fallen in love at the age of 16 with an inherently incompatible man. To know that Gregory had loved her too, but in a way that was so utterly useless that it could not hope to serve as a foundation for a real life together, was the icing on the cake. There was no way around the fact that he had been a giant piece of bad luck. Still, on the days when she had been at her lowest ebb, when Chip had been shouting at her and she had had to face the exposure of his most underhanded deceptions, she had gone to bed sobbing and calling in her heart on the man with wings who had used to regularly come, in her imagination, and sit beside her bed in her mother's apartment in Milnberg, the angel who could make her believe that everything could still turn out right in the end. This was as close as Vivian got to religion in those years, since she stopped going to church when Chip had declared he did not want to go to a Roman Catholic church since he was an Anglican, and then when she suggested that they go to an Anglican church, he just came up with other excuses not to go. going to bed, pulling up the covers, and occasionally praying for salvation in a weak moment, when her angel with Gregory's face sat beside her bed in her mother's old dining chair as he always had, his gray wings rising majestically over the shoulders of his dark suit jacket. This was her religion, so simple and childlike that it somehow managed to fly beneath the radar of her otherwise skeptical, practical mind. To either separate or to unify this angel with the man whom she had loved but who had so disappointed her would have involved the kind of theologian's mental calisthenics that were not part of Vivian's nature, and she pushed all such thoughts back to the deep recesses of her mind. Nadine had written to Vivian about how she had lost her first child in childbirth, a fate far worse than Vivian had faced in either of her 2 failed pregnancies, and how Gregory had come and helped them all, and how he had arranged for the funeral and burial. Vivian had wondered then how it would have been to have Gregory nearby to help her when she had had her miscarriages, to be able to talk to him and to know that he would have helped her in any way that he could. It was obviously true that one could be a good man without necessarily making a good husband, but as this once again touched on the complex gray realm between the angel and the man, Vivian finally folded up Nadine's letter and tried to think of something else. Nadine was an enthusiastic writer and wrote to Vivian frequently at the beginning. Vivian very much appreciated these letters. They were, as Nadine had always been, almost always upbeat and lively in tone, and Vivian came to look forward to them even more than to the letters from her own mother. But Vivian herself was not a good correspondent. She never had been, and she struggled with what to write back. Vivian's life was not going all that well, and she did not want Nadine to know, and she most certainly did not want her mother to know. There were only so many bland, "the weather is getting warmer here" kinds of things she could write before she would hit upon the uncomfortable facts like, "I still have the job cleaning toilets at the hotel, but am now also going to be washing dishes in a nearby restaurant," or, "The money to pay the landlord this month is not where I left it," or, "Chip didn't come home again last night." After a while, Nadine's letters also slowed. Both friends agreed that they should do a visit, but lack of funds was always an issue, and then Nadine got pregnant again and gave birth to Frank Jr., and Vivian had Sophie, and to travel that far away was out of the question for either of them. As soon as Vivian got the news of Frank Jr.'s birth, she sewed a small receiving blanket and a bonnet and infant gown, and sent them down in a small package, which Nadine was very happy to receive. Vivian never asked Nadine about Gregory, or if Nadine had seen him about town. But then Nadine wrote saying that she had walked by and seen that Wolfgang Gerstner's store was closing, and she had gone in and briefly spoken with Mr. Gerstner. Business was bad since the war had started, he said, and when she had asked what he planned to do next, he had begun to give an answer but then stopped himself and just said that he was not entirely decided yet. He told Nadine that Gregory had nobly enlisted even before the draft began, and that he was now serving somewhere in the Pacific. Vivian had folded up that letter and had sat in her armchair for a long time in the gathering dusk, remembering the conversation that they had had so long ago about enlisting in the war, and she wondered if that conversation was what had driven Gregory to enlist. At 29 or 30, he was not at risk of being pulled into the war in an initial draft, so why had he volunteered? Could it really have been his pride, because Vivian had told him that Chip said he would go enlist should war break out? Her thoughts were interrupted by her husband opening the door and waving an unusually jovial hello to her, but when he came closer to kiss her, she coldly pushed him away. That this rodent was still smoothly striding the streets of Manhattan, while a paragon of virtue like Gregory was fighting his war for him in the Pacific, was suddenly too grotesque to tolerate. After Chip was gone and Sophie was born, Vivian wrote to her mother to move closer so that she could help with the baby. The same day that she went to Penn Station to meet her mother, Vivian took baby Sophie to the photo booth at Penn Station and got a few pictures taken with her, one of which she sent to Nadine, accompanied by a short letter. She looked at one of the copies of that photo now and saw her sunken-in cheeks and her sleep-deprived eyes, and she wondered how she had survived giving birth and coming home from the hospital to no one but Edith and the other neighbors. Where she could, she had taken Sophie with her to her jobs at first, but that made her so exhausted that she thought she would keel over dead. She had held out more on hope than anything else, until her mother at last arrived. They settled into their new life together easily, as if they had never been apart, and for the first time, Vivian was able to tell her mother everything about how those early years up north had been, and what her marriage with Chip had been like. Then, with the entire story told, and as if by silent mutual agreement, they never really spoke of Chip much again. Their conversations were mostly filled with all things to do with Sophie, and they also reminisced about New Orleans, and daydreamed about a return visit, and all of the places that they would take Sophie to see. They never spoke of Gregory at all. Their tiny Queens apartment became hopelessly small for Sophie once she began walking and then running, so they spent as much time as they could visiting city parks, and of course no park was as wonderful as Central Park in Manhattan, where on special occasions Vivian would take Sophie to ride the carousel. Looking at Sophie and how happy a child she was, oblivious to the hardships of life around her, made Vivian determined to do all she could to give Sophie a better life than Vivian had ended up with. Without thinking of Gregory directly, or even really making the connection that he had helped to shape Vivian's dreams of what a wonderful future for a girl could be like, Vivian imagined that Sophie could get a better education and read smart books and visit the free museums to see all of the best art that New York had to offer, and go to see plays and concerts, and in general live the kind of life where she would never have to wash a dish or wait on a table to earn her living. At work, Vivian had heard two of her women colleagues talking about a new parenting book just recently published by a certain Dr. Spock, and she dutifully went out to buy it, bringing the total of books she owned to two, Dr. Spock and Gregory's old copy of Bulfinch's Mythology, which she had never returned to him. She had heard on the radio that reading out loud to even small children expanded their vocabulary and their brains, so on rare nights when she was not completely exhausted, she read out loud to Sophie from these two books. Sophie seemed not to mind that she did not understand anything, and always quickly fell asleep. Then Vivian would tuck the blanket around her small form, kiss her forehead, and go to sit with her mother and help with some sewing, if she still had the stamina. As hard as life often was, winter made it even harder. The cold, the early darkness, and the inability to keep Sophie content indoors combined to create a real cabin fever misery for them all. Vivian's mother bought Sophie a small box of crayons, which Sophie used to color all over the pages of Dr. Spock's child-rearing guide. She had opened the cover of the antique copy of Bulfinch's Mythology and had gotten started with scribbling on the inside of that when Vivian noticed, swooped in, and administered a stern admonition and some immediate punishment, which caused Sophie to howl. "This child will make me lose my mind!" cried Vivian. "You were hardly different," said her mother from the kitchen. "The day I caught you sitting on the floor and swallowing loose buttons was not a day I will ever forget. I had no idea how many you had swallowed before I got to you, and then I desperately checked your diaper for days to see if they all came out." "More disgusting than making a mess with crayons," agreed Vivian. "And that boring child-rearing manual at least has some color in it now. No mother of my generation ever had to get a book to figure out what to do with her baby. I should think it is all silliness of the first order, and that this man is just playing off of the worries of new mothers to sell them his book. And a book on the raising of babies that is written by a man? Well, really now. Let Sophie color in it until all the pages are covered with her scribbles, and if you have any questions on child-rearing, just come to me. It just so happens that I have a wonderful daughter who turned out quite fine of a person, so I have excellent credentials," her mother replied with a smile. Sophie's 4th birthday was coming up, and when Vivian asked her what she wanted, Sophie said she wanted a pony to ride. Where did she get these ideas? Vivian wondered. The man who could have gotten you that went out of my life years and years ago. And with that one thought, the images of Thibodeau and of brief happiness came into her mind suddenly, and without her being able to stop them. There was Gregory riding D'Artagnan across the meadow, and then they were riding together and his arm was about her. She had blocked these memories in her mind for years, and suddenly here they were, seeping out. She saw the small creek where they had sat. She saw the Mullins dining room, and the face of Mrs. Mullins. "Vivian, are you all right?" "Vivian," her mother said in alarm. "You looked like you might faint suddenly. Maybe you should stop working on this birthday cake and let me finish. You go and sit down." Vivian nodded mutely. She saw Gregory's small cottage and remembered standing in front of it and wondering what it would be like to live there with him. He would have taken Sophie riding, without a doubt, pulling the lead of her pony, like Rhett Butler had pulled Bonnie along in Gone with the Wind, which Vivian had gone to see after Nadine's repeated urgings. One could only believe that Clark Gable was the handsomest man ever seen on the earth if one had not yet seen Gregory. And now to imagine how it would have been if he had ever known Sophie. Well, it was just beyond all heartbreak, wasn't it? It took a few moments for Vivian to pull herself back to rational thinking. That, of course, if she had married Gregory and lived with him in his cottage, Sophie would never have come to be. And that was also beyond all imagining. In the end, Sophie had to settle for a gift of a small box that Vivian's mother had cut an opening into and had rigged up to be a small puppet theater with 5 small puppets that she had sewed out of leftover fabric scraps. It was not as good as a pony, but Sophie seemed content enough with it. She was eager to have Robert come and play with her puppets also, but Robert had no patience for puppets, and he threw everything about until Sophie launched herself at him, and the real activity of their playdate began, which was their inevitable wrestling. Edith threw up her hands in despair. Christmas arrived, and the city was unexpectedly buried in a giant blizzard. Vivian took Sophie to the park to build a snowman, an outing which ended with Sophie screaming like a vengeful goddess of wrath rather than enjoying the snow. After a few attempts to stack 3 larger snowballs on top of each other, Vivian gave it up and dragged Sophie back home. For Christmas that year, Vivian got her mother a luxurious bar of soap and took her to the matinees to see the movie It's a Wonderful Life, which Angela had so praised. Vivian had heard that there was an angel in the movie, but when she saw him, he was as far from her vision of Gregory post-canonization as possible, and she sighed. Why was she thinking of him so often suddenly? For years, Gregory's memory had rarely leaped out at her or pulled on her heartstrings like this. But now, as Sophie was past the difficult toddler years, it was as if Vivian suddenly had the mental and emotional space to have a coherent thought again, and her mind was pulling forward the backlog of memories that she had not yet fully processed. She never said anything to anyone as these memories came, but as 1948 began, she found herself standing by the apartment window more and more often and looking vaguely into the street, as if half expecting to see him there among the other slightly out-of-focus individuals, walking along, his dark suit contrasting starkly with the cold, muddy gray and white of late winter in Queens. Spring slowly started to make its appearance in fits and starts. The fir trees shrugged the snow off of their branches, and a new energy came into the New York City area and its dwellers. But Vivian found herself unexpectedly tired, her nights restless, and her sleep disturbed. Strange and vivid dreams came over her, she who rarely dreamed at all. In the morning she would sit, groggy, in the small kitchen, and staring into the gray light of the early day, a cup of coffee in her hands and trying to shake the sense of disorientation that her dreams had left her with. She found herself dreaming of Chip, whom she had almost managed to wipe out of her mind for a while, and in her defenseless state while asleep, her memory dredged forth painful recollections of their relationship and its deterioration. She sipped at her coffee and thought of how it had been when she had first moved away with him, how they had arrived in New York, and how frightened she had been of the immensity of the place. From the beginning, Chip was more consoling of a partner at night than in the daytime, and she quickly discovered that he did not like hearing her fears or her complaints. Every time she mentioned New Orleans, he took it as an attack on his decision to move them up north, so she began to hide her homesickness from him. And once you begin hiding something from someone, it is ever easier to hide yet other things after that, she discovered. Soon she did not tell him much at all about her inner world or what she truly felt. He seemed not to mind. As caught up in her own miseries as she was, it took Vivian a while to notice that Chip had secrets of his own that he hid from her. The gradual unveiling of the exact nature of his business dealings, starting as far back as New Orleans where he had operated as an unlicensed liquor trader down at the port, played a large part in the demise of their relationship, and Vivian came to discover that she had, in fact, known close to nothing about Chip before she had married him. She thought now again of the day that she told him she was pregnant, and how he had looked at her warily and said that he did not think he was ready for all of this, a reply that had stunned her and that broke much of the trust she had in him. He did not think he was ready? Well, what was Vivian to say then? Certainly no one had asked her if she felt ready. The worst of all Vivian's nightmares came with the loss of her first pregnancy. She was alone when it happened, and the experience itself was terrifying, but in the dreams that followed, it became even worse. On and off for weeks afterward, she would wake up drenched in cold sweat and crying. and to his credit, Chip tried to support and comfort her at first. But then the early dawn came, when she woke up close to screaming, and Chip was sitting on the edge of the bed already, with his head in his hands, angry and bitter with her. "What is wrong?" she asked him, inwardly thinking that he should be the one asking this of her, and not the other way round. "What is wrong? What is wrong? My wife keeps calling out the name of another man in her sleep, and there should be nothing wrong," cried Chip. Vivian felt a shudder sweep her damp, cold limbs. What do you mean?" she asked. "Ever since you lost this baby, you've been all on edge, and now you have these nightmares where you keep calling for Gregory. It is more than any man should have to put up with. What did that cut-rate drunk ever mean to you that you would think of him now? There must be more than you ever told me, Viv. That's all I know for certain." And his voice rose with every sentence, until Vivian was convinced that the neighbors could hear. "He never touched me," she said, curling away from Chip now, although a moment ago she had been reaching for him. "I know that," Chip spat back at her. "Or do you imagine that your lack of bedroom skills was not plenty apparent to me when I married you? No, what is hard to bear is that you clearly loved him. Oh, do not bother to deny it." Vivian started crying then. "He was a good friend," she tried to explain. "It is understandable." Chip stood up and turned to give her a cold look. "It is unforgivable. That is what it is," he said in an icy voice. "Can you not understand at all?" she cried. "To me it was as if I had lost my friend and father. Does that deserve no pity?" "I deserve pity. I married a woman who does not love me. If we are unhappy now, it is your fault." He walked out on her many times after that, but as that was the first time, it was the most shocking and the most painful. Although they made their peace a few days later, the shadow that had come over their marriage with this incident never really went away, and in the coming nights, Vivian found herself awake and trying to keep herself from dreaming, lest she inadvertently say Gregory's name out loud again, because then Chip might leave her, and how would she survive in New York all alone, and without even enough money for a train ticket home? That was the moment that she determined to work as many jobs as she could, so that she could save up enough to leave him if she ever needed to. Even years later, she could still pull up the fierceness behind that inner decision, and she could feel all of its power. It took 5 more years for them to separate, but the rift had already been made. In hindsight, the rift had begun even before they had arrived in New York, with the underhanded way that Chip had taken Vivian away from New Orleans and from her mother and her friends. Another night now, when the strong wind of early spring pushed at the windows as if trying to get in, Vivian dreamed of the time when Chip had taken her to the movies to see Casablanca, an over-emotional love movie of the kind that only someone like Nadine could admire. "Why, I would think this was exactly to your liking. A young woman choosing between 2 suitors. Please just note that although she picked the boring one, she wished she had chosen the nightclub owner and barman." He smirked as he said this, in a way that made Vivian want to slap him. What an ass he was being. "Are you quite done?" she remembered thinking. "Are you altogether done making stupid remarks and innuendos about me?" At that point, Gregory's name had not been spoken between them in a solid year, and to suddenly be reminded that Chip had never forgotten Vivian's friendship with Gregory was unsettling. What other grudges was he holding below the surface that might jump out at her at any time in their interactions? Mistrust flooded her, and even dreaming of it now with Sophie beside her, every nuance of her emotions from that time came back to her, with a sharpness that she could hardly believe possible. It was as if Chip and all of his deceptions and backstabbing were now finally being purged from her mind, like a poison leaving her body. Sophie was a sound sleeper, and did not seem to waken in the night when Vivian did. She raced around the apartment each Saturday and Sunday until it was time to go outside, and then it was as if she had been shot out of a cannon. Either Vivian's mother or Edith and Robert went with them, which added to the festive atmosphere of their park visits. One day, Vivian awoke to a sunny if cold morning, and Sophie was already pulling her boots on, although she was still dressed in her nightgown. That was how impatient she was to go out. "I also feel impatient," thought Vivian. "It is as if something were going to happen, perhaps even something unexpectedly good." They had lunch, went outside with Edith and Robert, and Vivian kept looking out for something unexpected and good to happen. But nothing out of the ordinary happened. The next 2 days it rained. Then they went to the park again, a different one this time, and maybe it was that the day was cloudy, but the feeling of excitement that Vivian had had did not return. It was turning out to be a very strange and moody spring. Then, on another brisk but sunny day, Vivian's mother went out after lunch to do a dress fitting with a lady client, and Vivian and Sophie were waiting for Edith and Robert to go out with them to Central Park, when Robert ran into an open dresser drawer and ended up with a bloody lip. They waited for a while to see if the bleeding would stop, but Edith wrung her hands in despair and told him to go on without them, so Vivian found herself alone in Central Park with Sophie. Vivian was secretly jealous of the other mothers they met, who walked with their offspring obediently by their side. Sophie would only hold hands for a moment or two before tearing off again on her own, running ahead and making a huge amount of noise. She was like live fire, impossible to catch, and the only time Vivian could really hold her now was in the evenings or at night when Sophie was asleep. She moved in small, quick bursts, like a bee moving from flower to flower, her cheeks bright with the chill air, and her shining hair streaming out from under her winter hat, which was knotted tightly under her chin. They both stopped together at the statue of the falconer, because Sophie always liked to admire the falcon sculpture, and today, as on most days, she pointed up at it excitedly and asked for the 100th time if they would see a bird just like it in the park today. Vivian replied that she did not think it was very likely. Then they headed to Cherry Hill Fountain, and Sophie ran around it like a miniature tornado until Vivian had to call for her to stop. The park had more visitors than it had had in a long while. Dog owners were out walking their dogs. Sophie ran to try to pet them all, and it was all Vivian could do to catch up, her lungs unhappy and straining. "Sophie! Sophie, slow down! Wait for me! Sophie, oh, really now, will you ever learn to obey your mother?" A gust of wind sent Vivian's hat almost sailing away, and she had to pause to clutch it to her head. This gave Sophie an additional lead. They came to a smaller path, heading toward the lake where they liked to walk, and Sophie was running along it, when all of a sudden, something unexpected happened. A tall man stepped out of the trees and onto the path in front of her. Sophie was not looking up ahead and was still running at high speed. Vivian's heart almost stopped as she watched up ahead. She tried to call out a warning, but was paralyzed with shock. Sophie reached the man and gave a small squeal of surprise as the stranger avoided the coming impact of her running body by picking her up. There was something about the movement as he reached down for her, about his arms as they lifted her up, and Vivian could just briefly make out the lower part of his face that was not obscured by his hat. This was no stranger. Could it be? In an instant her fear vanished, and her heart leapt with joy as she started running in earnest now, and when her hat blew away into the trees, she did not even stop to notice. The world had shrunk down to a single path, with nothing on it but the two figures just up ahead, and behind them, the late afternoon sun swallowed everything else in a blaze of light.